With elections in the Netherlands less than 2 months away, the eyes of Europe's political pundits are being drawn to the clash between the incumbent People's Party and the insurgent Party for Freedom, led by the charismatic controversialist Geert Wilders. Will the Dutch be the next domino to fall to right-wing populism? And what exactly is the deal with Wilders, a man who was banned from travelling to Britain due to his vociferous criticism of Islam? I'm joined to discuss this by Douglas Murray, who writes on the issue in this week's magazine, and Melle Garshagen, the UK and Ireland correspondent for Holland's top newspaper, NRC. So Douglas, the Dutch elections are less than 2 months away. What looks to be the likely outcome?
Well, I think it'd be a very unwise person after the last year to make any predictions on any occasion that the public vote. But in this week's issue, I simply explain some of the possibilities, particularly in relation to Geert Wilders' vote, which is, I think, can safely say, without insulting anyone who's Dutch, that that is the aspect of it from outside Holland that is most interesting and is, for many people, most concerning, of course.
And what do you make of Wilders, Melle?
Well, obviously he's been around for quite a while, but it looks like this time he is really set to do extremely well in the elections, become the largest party or the second largest. I mean, it's still 2 months away, and we tend to have a short and furious campaigning season. The big television debates are still to be held, so a lot can change. But for the last couple of months, he has done extremely well, and he is set to shake up the political landscape.
And why is he doing so well in the polls?
Because his message of anti-EU, anti-migration, more money for the healthcare system, so left on sort of healthcare issues, and he wants to lower the retirement age again. Obviously that appeals to a aging population, and on the other hand, he's very much right-wing on EU and immigration issues, and that combination really does seem to appeal to a lot of voters.
And Douglas, you argue in your piece in the magazine that this isn't actually about illiberal beliefs amongst the voters. It's actually about a protest on behalf of liberalism.
Yes, I mean, one can't say, how everybody is voting, but I do think that's something that a lot of people outside and inside the Netherlands have missed about this, is that there's a way of simplifying this that I think is a mistake, of saying effectively Wilders is part of an authoritarian or anti-liberal backlash. And it's simply my observation that a lot of his supporters and a lot of the propulsion of the argument he's making, which of course other Dutch politicians in recent years have also made, is pinned precisely on defending elements of Dutch liberalism, which they see, rightly or wrongly as you may think, as being at risk. And I think, as I say, so from the outside, it's quite easy to say, oh, I see the Dutch are becoming authoritarian or something. And I think that it's necessary to understand the aspects of Dutch life, Dutch culture, which there is a legitimate concern about. I think this is something which has obviously much wider connotations than just in Holland, but I think in all of our countries at the moment there is a tendency to see political figures that you don't like and effectively deride their voters for thinking in a way that some people might find sympathetic. I think it's much more important to try to understand where people are coming from on these matters. And I think it's a great failure of the Dutch political class, among others, that they've been so unsympathetic, or at least so shallow, in listening to some very real concerns.
Melle, do you agree with that assessment about understandable concerns, that actually this could be a problem that has not been created by Geert Wilders or indeed by racist voters, or whatever you want to call them, but actually by those in power at the moment?
Well, I think so, because if you look at the current polls, it's not only Geert Wilders' Freedom Party which is doing well, but also the 50-plus party, which wants to stand up for people who are about to retire. And they're very much anti-establishment as well. So it's not only about immigration, it's not only about Islam, it's not only about the sort of racist tendencies of all of a sudden of part of the population. It is, in a way, about concerns how the country has been governed for quite a while.
And Ian says in his piece that roughly 4% of the Dutch population are Muslim. So, Douglas, why has this issue become so central?
Several things. I think, if I may say so, Ian Bruma slightly understates some of this problem, not just in numbers, but in impact. It's extremely obvious if you go to a city like Amsterdam or Rotterdam that this very swift demographic change in the Netherlands is not a fetid part of a certain type of voter's imagination. It is very real. If you go to parts of the outskirts, for instance, of Amsterdam, there really are mini Turkeys. There really are places that seem impossible to discern from parts of Morocco. I was in Holland about less than a year ago, and I remember in one area that was almost entirely Muslim immigrant. The only posters I saw anywhere that had anything to do with politics were posters for the re-election or supporting the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan. And that sort of thing, for a lot of Dutch people, as in other countries, is simply a matter of real concern. And by the way, there's one other thing, which is that in Baruma's piece he mentions this aspect of what some people laugh at as being a sort of, well, Wilders and co are, among other things, defending Dutch attitudes towards homosexuality, and some people pretend that this is in some way disingenuous, that they're saying that the Islamists are anti-gay and anti-other liberal rights, and that somehow this is itself authoritarian to respond to this. I think this is a terrible mistake. It isn't untrue, again, for an average citizen in a very liberal country to be concerned about whether those rights are monogenerational or not, and to worry about whether they're going to be rowed back, to worry whether, over time, long-acquired rights for women, for gays, for other minorities, including religious minorities, aren't going to be rowed back.
Mella, do you agree with that?
I do. I do want to note, though, that Wilders' support, he tends to do well also in parts of the country where relatively small amounts of Muslim immigrants live. For example, in the south. He has done well in some parts of big cities like The Hague. He hasn't done quite well in Amsterdam, where you do have a lot of Turkish and Moroccan, Dutch Moroccans, because they are Dutch citizens. So it is mixed. I think part of it is real. I think part of it is also people who vote for him, they imagine the threat of the Netherlands becoming hit by a wave or tsunami, as Wilders says it, of Muslim migrants.
May I just say, by the way, on that, I mean, the same phenomenon has been identified in this country and others of as it were, voters in areas that are less diverse being less in favour of diversity, shall we say. And of course there is one very clear reason for that, which is that the people who live in such areas may have had enough of diversity. And they may be in those areas precisely because they don't want what they see in a city like Amsterdam, and many of them will have left such places. I mean, there is always that tension. And one other thing very quickly, which is, of course, the issue of, as you know, I mean, the issue of as it effectively dual nationality is very raw and is much more complex, I think, than people have portrayed it in recent years. It is not nothing that when last year a German comedian was being prosecuted and then a Dutch comedian, Hans Teven, said something offensive of the same Turkish president, the Turkish consulate was found getting in touch with Turkish Dutch people to make official complaints. And see, are these people really Dutch? They're behaving at the behest of the Turkish government, which has given out orders. So I think there is a very legitimate reason to think, okay, you have a passport, okay, you have a document. Are you really Dutch?
Well, I agree in part. There's a well-known case of a Dutch journalist of Turkish descent who was persecuted or was arrested in Turkey when she went to her family home there because Dutch-Turkish people in the Netherlands basically informed the Turkish consulate about her remarks about Erdogan. And that does worry a lot of Dutch people. At the same time, I still have an apartment in Amsterdam in a very mixed neighborhood. And I also see that, there are examples, where communities do get along. And again, I want to stress that Wilders' rise has to do with Islam, with immigration, but it also very much has to do with things like healthcare and the changing of Dutch society.
But this does sound like a very strong example of a country that has stopped being liberal and perhaps has stopped being a standard bearer for liberalism, or is that too harsh an assessment?
I think it is too harsh of an assessment, and I don't think it's quite linear. I mean, at the moment there's a very strong debate about a strong Dutch tradition, the Dutch version of Christmas. It's called Sinterklaas, and he's an old man with a beard, and he brings presents, and he has assistants, and they are called Zwarte Piet, Black Piets. And the story is they're his helpers, and they come through the chimney, so they're dark. But through the ages they have turned into basically blacks, and they are portrayed in a racist way with big lips, earrings, curly hair. And for decennia this was accepted, and if you were against it you wouldn't be taken seriously. And now there's a very strong debate which has really polarized the country whether this is racist or not, and it really has come about in 2 or 3 years, or maybe 4 or 5 years. And you could say, well, the fact that the Dutch still have this tradition which is perceived as racist shows sort of the fact that the Dutch are becoming less liberal. At the same time, this debate is possible, and it has really changed the way we see this tradition. So there are still, I think, tendencies towards liberalism.
So if I can say that, the Black Pete issue is fascinating and obviously very galvanising within Holland. But there are two things we said about it. One is that it is, of course, a classic example which every country has of such a sort of sometimes frivolous seeming issue from outside feeling like it is a very central assault on your national identity and sort of isn't to be sniffed at for that reason. It becomes totemic of other things that you see being taken away. The other thing, of course, is that there is much like one hesitates about drawing the parallels, but just as Trump voters were very often people who were fed up with the liberal media talking about which bathroom you should use after you'd had which operation, depending on which gender you identified with that day. And we're thinking, I haven't got a job. What are you people doing? In the same way, I think that this obsession with, are we being racist? Are we being politically correct? And so on. In countries like Holland and all of our countries, which are facing serious issues about welfare and how to pay for ourselves and so on, looks decadent in some way. And I think it's not a mistaken concept there.
And so this is a trend that we can see across Europe. And is that trend very similar in other countries, do you think, Melle?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at the decline of social democracy, of the Dutch version of Labour, they are seen as being pretty much like Labour here, too cosmopolitan, too much geared towards the EU, which is an elitist project. In that sense, I do think a lot of people feel ignored about what they're concerned about, which is, do I have a pension which is enough to cover the cost, which is similar to previous generations? Will my children have a future here? Will they be able to go to school, get an education, get a good job, and be free in the way they want to be?
I agree. I think these are the galvanising issues for people. And I think that obviously the clever thing that Wilders has done in recent years is, as you say, this thing of effectively doing that. It's happened elsewhere, but you have quite strong, strident views that may appeal to what are part of the traditional right of the spectrum, and then have some economic views that effectively would appeal more to what would have been the left of the spectrum. And that's, I think Wilders has obviously identified that second bit as being his way through, the way to break through the impasse that he's hit several times now. Because, I mean, it is worth remembering that we have had versions of this story for quite a long time, mainly the EU elections, I mentioned in my piece, where very often Wilders has been expected to do much better than he's actually ended up doing.
That was Douglas Murray and Melle Garshagen.